Barely, okay. I'll speak directly into the microphone. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Paul Peppis, the director of the Oregon Humanities Center. I want to welcome you to this, the fourth in our lecture series this year on the topic of justice. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, Lori Gruen, let me just say a couple of housekeeping things and thanks, as I always do. We have our information table, which you saw as you came in. It tells about sponsored and co-sponsored events that are happening in the future. You can sign up for our newsletter, get on our mailing list. We'll have a Q&A after the talk. We're live streaming it, so you'll come to the mics to ask your questions. Please come to the mic, speak into the mic so the people who are watching at home can hear what you say. After the Q&A, we'll have a book signing. And what's the next thing on my list? Go away. Thanks. I have to thank the people that I always thank, our collaborators in EMU Event Services and the Center for Media and Educational Technologies for their logistical and technical support. Thanks also and always, as always, to the OHC's wonderful, amazing staff, our Associate Director, Julia Hayden, our Program Coordinator, Melissa Gustafson, our Communications Coordinator, Peg Gerhart, and our Student Assistant, Christy Creighton. Without the committed help of our staff and collaborators, the Oregon Humanities Center would never be able to organize events like this and host world-class scholars and public intellectuals like our speaker tonight, the William Griffin Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Environmental Studies, and the Animal Studies Coordinator at Wesleyan University, Professor Lori Gruen. Professor Gruen will present this year's Robert D. Clark Lecture in the Humanities. The Clark Lecture was established in 1994 and has been sustained since then through the generosity of the Oregon Community Foundation. We are grateful for the Foundation's steadfast support of the humanities and the OHC. The Clark Lecture aims to promote public discussion on the natural sciences, the history of Oregon, and the interface between science and social and cultural affairs, as exemplified by Thomas Condon, legendary frontier missionary, geologist, paleontologist, and founding member of the University of Oregon. The lectureship was named for you, O President Emeritus Robert D. Clark, author of The Odyssey of Thomas Condon. Given the Clark Lectureship's emphasis on the public discussion of the natural sciences and the interface between science and the humanities, and our theme this year of justice, Lori Gruen is an ideal choice for this year's Clark Lecturer. An innovative and activist philosopher, Professor Gruen's work lies at the intersection of ethical theory and practice, with a particular focus on issues that impact those often overlooked in traditional ethical investigations: women, people of color, and non-human animals. She has authored or edited books on such varied and pressing issues as sex, morality, and the law, stem cell research, environmental philosophy, ecofeminism, the ethics of captivity, animal liberation, and ethics and animals. Her latest book is Entangled: Empathy, an Alternative Ethic for a Relationship with Animals. Tonight, Professor Gruen, as you can see here, will speak to us on the topic of justice and empathy beyond the human. Please join me in welcoming Lori Gruen.
Can you hear me okay? Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm delighted to be giving this Clark Lecture. I want to also thank the Oregon Humanities Center staff who've been amazing in their organization, and I really do appreciate being able to be out here. So it seems like, especially in times like our current time, when there's so much racial violence and gender discrimination and Islamophobia and the host of global injustices that permeate our world, that talking about non-human animals may seem a little bit peculiar. I'm hoping to convince you that there's a deep connection between conceptualizing non-human animals as disposable and treating other humans as disposable. So I don't think of these things as being at odds with one another. In fact, I think, and I'm hoping I convince you, that there are really very close connections between these very deep and pressing concerns. I also wanted to say, by a way of a little bit of introduction, that I have been working a lot with chimpanzees over the last decade. So part of what's nice about having a big screen like this is that I can introduce you to some of my chimpanzee buddies. And so a lot of the cases that I want to talk about will involve chimpanzees. But I want to be clear that this isn't just about chimpanzees. And I think that my view, which I'll describe to you, is one that I think is particularly important for writing all sorts of relationships we have with very different others, not just chimpanzees. But the chimpanzees are pretty special, and I'll be excited to introduce you to them. So at this important moment, when we're confronting genuine divisions between the right and the left, between Republicans and Democrats, between whites and blacks, it seems that it's all the more important to be focused on matters of justice. And traditionally, we think about justice as what all people deserve, as due regard, when there's no morally relevant distinction that would warrant justice being denied. And because, for example, someone might be shorter or somebody is taller, they don't deserve to be treated any differently. They don't deserve more or less justice or respect simply because they're taller or shorter. We might make higher doorways for taller people. We might make steps for shorter ways. So there's for shorter people, but there's different ways of achieving justice. But the claims to justice are equal. It doesn't matter. Because someone's a man or someone is a woman, they don't deserve more or less justice. And we are seeing, importantly, that women are being included in more and more arenas where they have been excluded. And there may actually be a time soon, or at least we can hope, that women will be getting equal pay for equal work. But that's a movement towards justice. And of course, the Black Lives Matter movement reminds us that we still have a long way to go to really achieve anything resembling justice for poor communities of color in our criminal justice system, for many queer and transgendered people, particularly poor and black and brown folks, for immigrants, many, many, many other of our fellow human beings. We do have a lot of justice work to do. But tonight, I'd like to talk about both justice and really with a focus on empathy beyond the human. And I want to say a few things about my own understanding about this intersection that Paul just mentioned between human oppressions and non-human oppressions, lest there be any confusion. So before I get into sort of talking more elaborately about my view about empathy and its relationship to justice, some of the concerns that people have raised about whether or not empathy is the right way to think about our social relations, I want to say a little bit about some of the dangers that happen when you're talking about humans and non-humans together. So last summer, some of you may have heard that in Zimbabwe, did you hear about Cecil the lion? Right, everybody heard about Cecil the lion, right? So in case any of you happen to be sort of out of media contact at that time, let me just give you a little brief synopsis of what happened. So this wealthy white dentist from Minneapolis went over to Zimbabwe, and he felt entitled to kill a somewhat endangered, somewhat enculturated, some controversy about Cecil there, but decided that this lion was someone he could kill. His name was Walter Palmer, and he had a history of illegal poaching. And what happened in this case is he and the man, two men who he paid quite a lot of money to in Zimbabwe, lured Cecil out of a protected habitat, and with a dead corpse, obviously a corpse is dead, sorry, with a corpse of another animal, and then shot Cecil with a crossbow. And that didn't kill the lion, and the lion injured, went back to his habitat, and they figured out a way to get him out and kill him. And they shot him the second time and skinned him, realized it was, the well-known lion Cecil, but then they beheaded him. And this caused so much outrage, which is part of why you've probably heard of Cecil. There was just a tremendous amount of outrage about this cavalier killing. There were protests in front of Palmer's dental clinic. That's one of them. And one of the things that happened in response to this somewhat outrageous killing is that defenders of hunting suggested that the protesters didn't really have an adequate understanding of the life cycle, that they didn't recognize that sort of death is a natural part of life. And so what was happening is that these protesters needed to be less sentimental, less emotional, less fearful, and more accepting of the attitude about death. But of course, those who purposely bring about premature death actually are running the risk, and it's a high risk, of turning those individuals that they kill into disposable beings, thinking about others as disposable, especially when it's premature death, as it was in the case of Cecil. And it's this very idea, that we can use and dispose of other animals as we please, that really is at the heart of the protest. It's not so much about not understanding the natural cycle of life and death, but it's really about the disposability and the instrumentalization of this creature. And perhaps also a fair amount of sort of arrogant intervention in the life of a free animal. Now, all of this attention to Cecil actually led to another sort of outcry, and this is related to what I wanted to highlight about some of the dangerous areas that happen when you're thinking about animals and humans, non-human animals and human animals in the same context. So at this time, that very same week, Samuel DuBose was an innocent individual, a black man, was driving in the University of Cincinnati, and a police officer shot and killed him. Sandra Bland, who was driving and was brought into jail and found dead, she had failed to signal a lane change, was arrested and brought to jail, was found dead, was also happening a week before that, or a week or two before that. And so one of the things that ended up happening in the case of Samuel DuBose, in the case of Sandra Bland, and those were two in a long line of black men and women who had been killed by police or died in the hands of police, and that list goes on. It seemed when all of this outcry was happening about Cecil the lion, that there was some sort of failure to recognize the horror and death of Samuel DuBose, of Sandra Bland, and many of the other folks. And so what ended up happening, Roxane Gay joked in the New York Times that maybe she should wear a lion suit. So in case she got killed, people would pay more attention. She's a black woman. And one of the weird things that happened at that moment was that there was this outcry over why people care more about animals than they care about black and brown people. And then it got particularly peculiar that caring about animals itself was thought to be racist. And that, I think, is a real unfortunate way of thinking about the injustices that are going on. And it's one of the things that I reflected on in an Al Jazeera op-ed. This is a real sort of failure of understanding how intersectional oppressions operate. And what it did was it created a zero-sum mentality where if you care for one group of endangered or oppressed or exploited or instrumentalized individuals, you can't also care about another group. But you know, when you have that kind of division between a group that you really are maybe more personally passionate about than another, it doesn't mean that you don't also care very deeply about the oppression and exploitation and the disposability of others. And it ends up reinforcing the structures that allow for the disposability of some over others. So what I want to suggest is that we need to remember, importantly, the role that animalization, the process of making animal, has had as an ideology that has been very operative historically in the construction of Black people as less than human. It's a central way, for example, that we justify mass incarceration, right? So often people would say, oh, you're making a mistake. You really shouldn't treat humans like animals. And I think, well, you really shouldn't treat animals like animals. And that's what I said in the op-ed. The funny thing about this op-ed is that many, many, many people really didn't understand, because this is so zero-sum. Our mentality is so clearly, if we want justice for one, we can't have justice for all. My view is that we really should have justice for all, but it's a particular kind of justice, and so that's what I want to turn to. Before I turn to that, however, I think that it's really important to recognize the ways in which our arguments for the inclusion of people who are traditionally excluded and our arguments for the inclusion of non-human animals who have traditionally been excluded parallel one another. And what happens essentially in these arguments for extending justice outward is that we think about what traits or qualities do these individuals have that are morally relevant or morally irrelevant. What kinds of traits or qualities do these other beings have that we want to recognize that they deserve consideration with us? And this is the way that animal ethics has gone. As Jeremy Bentham famously put it, the question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And so the idea traditionally about the notion of justice has been that we should look for similarities, ways in which we at the center who deserve justice should recognize justice in others. And these similarities have led to a tremendous amount of really interesting thoughts and knowledge about other animals. So one of the things that we know about the ways now that animals are similar to us is that they use tools. Birds they develop these amazing tools so that they can dig grubs out of the most inaccessible spots. And New Caledonia crows, some of you may know, are able to build hooks to get at all sorts of food sources. My colleague Jill Preetz has shown us that chimpanzees in the wild are able to make spears, craft spears, teach their young to make spears, to hunt. And we see this all over. People have probably seen chimpanzees cracking nuts. So tool use is something that we now know other animals do all the time. There's also animals are able to manipulate their environments. Beavers do it, octopus do it, birds do it. Solve problems, they're problem solvers. Most animals solve all sorts of problems, both physical and social. Some animals use symbols. My chimpanzee friends actually do a lot of symbol use. Also, sea lions are also pretty well known for using symbols. Some even use language. Chimpanzees, again, pretty famous that way. And I know some of you were actually at the Clark lecture last year, yes, when Franz de Waal was here and showed a clip where capuchin monkeys have two sources of food, one high value, one low value. So a cucumber is low value and a grape is high value. And you exchange a chip for the food item, and you end up with one capuchin exchanging the chip and getting the grape, the high value item. And the capuchin that's watching this exchange exchanges the chip, gets the low-value food item, the cucumber, and throws it back at the researcher, thinking, this is unjust. Right? So even other animals have a sense, at least some other animals, of justice and injustice. Or we might say, at least betrayal. And what we do know is that other animals, in a variety of ways, are like us in many morally salient ways. They feel things. Their lives can go better or worse. They have meaningful relationships with others. There's all of these ways in which other animals are similar to us. I probably should say a little tiny bit about Emma working in the hydraulic, using the tool to work this hydraulic door. She's actually not fixing it herself. She's just mimicking what she saw the guy who was fixing the hydraulic door from doing. But that's also something animals do. They can imitate, they can emulate, they can deceive. They're remarkable. And they have many, many of the kinds of similar characteristics that we have. And it's those salient, similar characteristics that we think is what is the basis for extending our moral concern and our interest in justice to them, outward to them. But I have some worries about justice. And part of the worry is that it is a little bit too abstract and disembodied. And in many instances, it amounts to a kind of projection from ourselves to other animals that overlooks what matters or might matter to other animals from their own point of view. So that's one of the things that I think is particularly of concern. And one of the other things that we just went through, why does tool use matter? Did anybody have that thought? Why would that be a morally interesting thing? Tool use. So what if you use symbols? Why is that morally important? What if you didn't use symbols? Why does that matter? So part of what I think is really important to think about is that our traditional way of extending concerns for justice tends to overlook what might be really at the heart of what's valuable. And that is partly what I think empathy, care, and love can do. So I want to turn to a discussion about the ways in which empathy, care, compassion, and love play a very, very central role in our thinking about our relationships beyond the human. And this is just, I think, a really remarkable and important quote from Bell Hooks. Love isn't just about erotic love or intimate love, but love, care, compassion, and ultimately what I call empathy is going to be, I think, a real way of thinking beyond the constraints that we find in our worries about justice. And my own work is really meant as an alternative to this sort of framework of extending from the moral center outward to other animals. Now, I'm going to say a little bit about this in a minute, but I want to say it now, too, so that I can repeat it. I do not see justice and empathy as opposites or in a dichotomous relationship. There is a history of thinking about the justice approach and the care approach. Some of you may have heard about it. It came out of topics in moral psychology and the development of a psychological attitude towards others. Some think about it in terms of justice and principles, and others think about it in terms of care and affection. You'll see, I don't see this dichotomy as central as others might see it. So I just wanted to highlight that and flag that for right now. Okay, so my alternative approach is what I call entangled empathy. The central part of entangled empathy is that we're already in ethical and unethical, importantly. We're in good and bad relationships with other animals. And making these relationships ethical really requires us to understand the other. And that requires a lot of thought. It's not just feeling. I think that understanding is best understood through this process of entangled empathy. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about what that process looks like and how it's understood. And one of the things that we need to be aware of is that there's a lot of different ways of thinking about empathy. Empathy means a lot of different things to various people. And so I want to just give you a couple of examples. You could look here up at the slide. Empathy is some people think about it as a time when you put yourself into the shoes of another being, but that's not only what empathy is. Some people think of it as an emotional response that's more appropriate to someone else's situation than one's own. So you take your own feelings and you put them aside and you sort of just try to live in the feelings of others. That's not quite what I have in mind either. And I also want to distinguish between empathy and sympathy. A lot of people have thought that empathy is merely about feeling with, where sympathy involves concern and care. But I think that in our current climate, when people send sympathy cards, that sympathy is actually really quite detached. So I like empathy, and again, it's my theory, so I could say I like empathy. But the idea here is that sympathy, it tends to remove you from the concerns of another. You might think, oh, I feel bad for you, but I'm not actually feeling with you in any sort of way. I'm not feeling connected. I just might feel sorry for you. And there's a worry about condescension and pity when you have this notion of sympathy. It didn't used to be the case. The early thinkers in the sentimentalist tradition would talk about sympathy, by which they meant something very similar to what I mean by empathy. But these days, in the age of Hallmark cards, I think thinking more about empathy, you don't go to the store and buy an empathy card, and that's good. I don't think we want empathy cards. That dispatches your moral concern. So sympathy is not what I'm talking about. Empathy is what I'm talking about. And my version of entangled empathy actually involves very specific kinds of capacities or engagements. So I want to give you a little bit of a sense about what that is. Empathy really requires attention to particularity. So you need to know what's going on. You can't make general kinds of claims about a particular, about a general, like animals. It doesn't, what does it mean to be an animal? What does it mean to actually care about animals? There isn't anything that it means to care about animals. You have to care about particular, specific, particular other animals who have very distinct looks. We could tell the difference between different chimpanzee expressions, different attitudes, different personalities. All of this is really centrally important to the view of entangled empathy that I'm trying to identify. You want to figure out whether or not this dog likes that dog. You don't want to talk about dogs in a general sense. You want to find out whether this student or that student has a propensity or fear or concern. You don't want to talk in general about students. So part of what entangled empathy requires is that we look at the particularity. It also involves perspective taking. So we want to be able to sit in a situation in which you're paying particular attention to a particular other and take their perspective. Not project your perspective onto what you think their perspective is. So we'll have some questions about this, I'm sure. But the idea is that you want to really do your best to try to understand what kind of perspective they might have. Part of the way we can do that is through contextual observation. I think it's really, really important to look at and pay attention to what's going on with others. And many of us can't spend time with lions. I've never spent time with lions. I've never actually spent very much time with a lot of other kinds of animals. But I know people who do, right? So if I don't have the time, energy, capacity, or wherewithal to spend time with others, with other kinds of beings, I can learn from those who do. So that's one of the things that's a central part of entangled empathy. We can do contextual observations, or we can rely on others to do them. It would be a very bad idea, for example, if all of us needed to go out into the savannah the way that Jill Preetz, who I mentioned earlier, does to watch chimpanzees doing what they do with their spears, which is hunt bush babies. And if we all went, like even if everybody in this room went, it would be a disaster. Could you imagine? So we couldn't really do that. We need to definitely pay attention to what Jill says and what other experts have to say about that. And one of the other aspects that I want to highlight about my view of entangled empathy is it focuses on flourishing. Fundamentally, we're not interested in just beings being beings, but we want them to be able to do as well as they might do. Flourishing is the kind of thing that is going to be different for others. Different kinds of creatures are going to have different kinds of flourishing, but flourishing is always sort of our eyes are on that prize. There's a baseline value that we're trying to be engaged in when we're thinking about empathy, and flourishing is that idea. So empathy is not, given that, the way I understand empathy, it's not simply an emotion, right? How could you just have an emotion that involved all of these very cognitive processes? So it's not simply about our imagination. It is very deeply reflective. Entangled empathy is a deeply reflective form of care. And importantly, it doesn't preclude expressions of outrage or anger, or guilt, for that matter. And so one of the things that happens a lot when I talk about empathy is people think that maybe what I'm talking about is being nice, but it's not about being nice. It's really about understanding the situation, trying to understand what others are experiencing in the situation, and sometimes that's going to mean the best and most appropriate thing to do in that context is be outraged. Or the most important thing to do is to be angered, or to realize that we might be doing something terribly wrong and maybe have some shame. So empathy is a kind of thing that is reflective and emotional. It involves cognition and affect, and it can go wrong in a lot of ways. And I don't want to say too much about the ways it can go wrong, but let me just say very, very briefly that it can go wrong by way of over-empathizing, something I do all the time. When I see people walking out in the middle, I think, oh no, they hate me, I'm being boring. And I imagine what that feels like, and I think, oh, that doesn't feel so good. This is the kind of thing, you don't want to over-empathize, you don't want to under-empathize. Actually, as much as I over-empathize, under-empathizing is much more ubiquitous. It's a real problem. So many people just don't care. So under-empathizing is also a way it can go wrong. I can think of, there's a sense in which people tend to imagine that other animals, like Cecil the lion, aren't actually the kinds of beings that have relationships or attitudes or ways of flourishing. That's a way of under-empathizing. The other thing that can go wrong is that we can do, part of the worry I have about empathy that comes up again, we only can know so much about the mind of another, or the attitudes of another, or the experiences of the other. And sometimes we can make mistakes about what they might or might not be thinking. So projection is another way in which we can make mistakes of empathy. We can really think that we know what's going on when we don't know what's going on. So humility is going to be an important corrective to empathy. It's got to go hand in hand. Okay, I want to say a couple of other things about empathy. And then what I want to do is consider some worries that have been expressed when I try to develop this view. So part of the reason that I think the empathy approach is better than some of the other approaches that have been central in thinking about what we might owe other animals that are based simply on justice, is that the justice frameworks tend to focus on individuals, and usually individuals as members of groups, rather than on the relationships between the individuals, both within their own social group and between members of different groups. And one of the things that's important, I think, about entangled empathy is it highlights the fact that we're all in relationships of a variety of kinds, and nobody wants to be in a bad relationship. At least that's what I'm hoping. if people recognize that they won't endorse the idea that they're in a bad relationship, then I think that that's going to be a very useful way of moving people from where they are to trying to enhance or improve the well-being of others. So entangled empathy moves us to focus not just on those immediate relationships, but on relationships that are more distant, and try to make those better. That's the flourishing part. We want to make these relationships better, making our relationships as good as we can make them. And I mean by that not just our relationships here, and not just our relationships at home, and not just our relationships in school, but our relationships to the animals that we eat and the animals that are far away from us, and the humans that might be far away from us. So everything we do impacts others. And part of what we want to be able to try to realize is how do we make those relationships, those impacts, as good as they might be. Okay, so part of reflecting on our entanglements serve as a kind of what I call perceptual therapy that helps to better understand who we are as individuals and how those relationships we are in can be improved. But, as I just suggested, there are two sorts of worries about this focus on entangled empathy that I think need to be highlighted. One set of concerns that I'll want to discuss comes from the psychological literature, and it sees empathy as being too biased. So I want to talk a little bit about that worry from the psychological literature, that empathy is it's too biased. And so it's not going to really get us to the place that I'm hoping it can get us in terms of our relationship with the more than human world. The other set of concerns that I want to mention, and I'm hoping that we can have a lot of discussion and questions and answers in the Q&A about, comes from environmentalists. And the worry here is that maybe the view of empathy is too limiting because it can't include other beings like forests and trees. Because my view, which seems to focus on beings that have something it's like to empathize with, is limited to maybe fish and birds and mammals and others that we have what we call a phenomenology, that is something that it's like to be them. If you don't have something it's like to be you, then you can't really empathize with that other being. And so one of the things that environmentalists have been critical of is that I'm excluding wetlands, trees, ecosystems. So let me say a little bit more about those things. The first is this worry about bias. Okay, so the skeptics, as I like to call them, and they're very popular. You might have seen some. Paul Bloom at Yale University is probably the biggest skeptic. He writes about against empathy. He's against empathy. You would think that's a really funny thing. Like if you were against empathy, just keep that to yourself, right? Who would want to be around you? But he's really big on this. Empathy, empathy, I'm against empathy. What he thinks, though, and this is, I think, an important consideration, is that some situations of injustice, the killing of Samuel DuBose, for example, the killing of Cecil, actually requires outrage. It requires indignation, something like that. And that isn't something he thinks you get out of empathy. Now, of course, I just told you, I think you can get anger and indignation out of empathy because it's an appropriate response to what just happened. If you imagine Samuel DuBose's sister, who happened to be very upset. Well, obviously, her brother had just been killed, but she was also really upset because Samuel DuBose, who was actually rescued dogs in their neighborhood, was also her #1 supporter as she's tried to open a vegan restaurant, right? I think we could all be outraged that Samuel DuBose was slaughtered needlessly, and we could also have empathy for his family and his sisters, and that's not really, we're not in contradiction when we're doing that. Again, I think the empathy that we're trying to think, that at least Paul Bloom thinks we should not have, might be the wrong kind of empathy, right? It might be just this reactive empathy as opposed to the reflective empathy that I'm talking about here. But he does have some pretty significant concerns. Two of them I want to discuss. There's a long list of biases that they think, that Paul, who's a psychologist, thinks we might have. But one of the really important, so there's a long list of biases, two important biases that I think we should discuss. One is what he calls in-group biases, and the other is what he calls proximity effects, or what others call proximity effects. So let me just say something about in-group biases. In-group biases in laboratory studies suggest that human beings have a capacity to empathize more with or care more about those that look like them. So if you see somebody who looks like you, you're going to empathize more with that individual. And because animals don't look like us at all, usually, depends, I guess, on the human. But in any event, most humans and animals don't look alike. And so the idea is then we're not going to have a very good way of empathizing. We're going to be biased towards our in-group, and we're going to be biased against those that don't seem in our in-group. But it actually turns out that many other studies have been done that suggest that all you need to do is reassess the likeness category. So in one particular study that was done, individuals who have a stronger group identity, a self-conception that's very strongly based on their group identity, will tend to illustrate this in-group bias initially, but simply by talking through their self-conception, and it's just a narrative, talking through their understanding of themselves as identified with that particular group will change their ability to empathize. And so that seems very good. It would be very bad from my view if this bias were immutable, that is, it wouldn't change. But it turns out that actually all you need to do is talk through it, and people under controlled conditions will actually change their empathy towards others. That seems promising. That bias is overcomable. Now, proximity effects are a really interesting set of problems, and I'm still struggling a little bit with proximity effects. But one of the thoughts that proximity effects, the worries about proximity effects are that we tend to be concerned about individuals that are closest to us or that are more in our immediate sphere. And so what the skeptics suggest is that, for example, and they always use this is now, again, Paul Bloom and also philosopher Jesse Prinz, who's at the City University of New York. And they have used this idea that people tend to care more and pay more attention and more money to those who died in Hurricane Katrina, which is only 1,836 people, as opposed to the 315,000 people who died in the Indonesian tsunami. And they often say things, for example, like caring more about the people who died in Katrina as opposed to those who are dying from starvation is a proximity bias that would work against the empathy theories that I've been trying to suggest we adopt. And so what their worry is that because they're closer to us, we care more about them. It's not that they're similar to us, but that they're closer to us in proximity. It seems to me that that's actually just false. I think that there's a lot of studies that have shown that there was a tremendous outpouring of concern for the victims of the tsunami. And it turns out that more money was sent to the victims of the tsunami than there was money sent to the victims of Hurricane Katrina, which is an interesting fact. The other thing, though, I think, is that sometimes proximity bias is really a matter of a media perception. So we're always going to be sort of stuck in an information gap if we don't have the kind of news that will cover horrible tragedies from afar, right? So we all know about Cecil because there was media saturation, but we probably don't know about many, and we certainly don't know about many, many other animals that have also been killed by trophy hunters in Africa. We just don't know about them. So of course, it's not that we actually don't care, it's that we don't know. And that's, I think, an important way of responding to the bias. What worries me most about the concerns about bias that I have, and I haven't fully worked out, but I'll just raise it, is that in the face of mass tragedies like Hurricane Katrina, like the tsunami, How do we empathize with each particular? Remember I said we need to be engaged with particular others? How do we empathize with each and every one of those individuals and their families who suffer? That is a potential for overload. And I think the way that I would answer that question is just to say that we don't need to empathize with each and every other in those kinds of extreme contexts. So we don't need to empathize, for example, with the billions of animals that are killed in the food industry to recognize that there's a tremendous tragedy going on, that we can have enough empathy that will help to move us to try to promote their flourishing. So those are some of the biases that have been worrisome to many of the psychologists and others who are skeptical of empathy, and I think that I do have some responses to them. Let me just tell you a little bit about the concerns that environmentalists have had with my view. This is a tree. It's called this is the senator, a tree that's 3,500 years old. Or anyway, this was a tree that was 3,500 years old. The tree burnt to the ground. There was a crack addict, some sort of drug addict, that got high, lit the tree on fire, and this 3,500-year-old tree, the senator, was no more. This is a tree that was around for a really long time, and now the tree is gone. Environmentalists say that there's nothing that my view can tell us about what's wrong with what just happened, and I hope at least some of you are thinking, oh my God, that's terrible. A 3,500-year-old tree, no longer, for no reason, burnt to the ground because someone forgot, or someone was high and lit the tree on fire. I actually do feel a tremendous sense of grief when I learned of this tragedy, and I hope you do. I feel a tremendous sense of sadness, loss, when I hear about meadows being paved or when I hear about toxics being dumped in wetlands. I think that a large part of my own sadness is for the individuals who called that place home, but there's more than that. There's something that's really, maybe you can call it species shame, something shameful about the destruction of our natural environment. There's actually all sorts of important values that are at stake when we engage in this kind of destructive behavior that we engage in. But my view of empathy doesn't actually cover that, because you can't empathize with the tree, because there's no way that the tree that we can know has a perception of their experiences, or the tree's experiences. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be other values that come into play in thinking about what we might owe or what we might do for natural environments. But it does mean that empathy does not apply to those kinds of individual creatures or beings, not creatures, beings or whole ecosystems. We don't empathize with ecosystems, but we might have other reasons for getting our attention directed to them beyond just the animals, birds, and other beings that we do empathize with living there. So I think that there's an important and interesting way in which our empathy can be directed to natural things by the creatures that live there, but it's not that we're actually mourning or grieving these natural spaces. Okay, let me just end with a little bit more practical, maybe upbeat. I hope upbeat, that sad tree dying. Oh, I forgot to tell you. So this tree is gone, 3,500-year-old tree is gone, but they did have a part of the tree that was grafted, and they were able to grow another tree. It's not obviously as old as this tree, but it's connected to this tree, and they had a naming ceremony and called that new tree the phoenix. So the phoenix did come to live, but the tree is gone. So let me end with a happy or somewhat happy story. I have come to my view of empathy from my relationships with many animals, but chimpanzees in particular. And I've developed a couple of resources for thinking about the chimpanzees that are currently in captivity in the US, one of which is The Last 1000. The Last 1000 is a website in which I put together the names of as many of the last 1,000 chimpanzees as I could uncover. And I'm trying to turn those names green when they retire to sanctuary. When I began this project, I thought maybe there would be chimpanzees that would be released from research facilities in my lifetime. And lo and behold, not only, I don't even have to get too old, I mean, I'm somewhat old, but not too old, because actually it happened. So there's no more research being done on chimpanzees at the moment. There's a lot of work that has to be done to get the chimpanzees from the labs to sanctuary, and some of them are on the move as we speak. But there's about 675 chimpanzees that are still in the laboratories awaiting sanctuary. But in my own lifetime, the efforts of a lot of people who had tremendous empathy for the chimpanzees and who are also concerned about justice have brought about some real practical change. So a lot of this was theoretical, and a lot of it is based on sort of abstract ideas, but there's very practical considerations. And I think the more that we can be involved in empathetic relations with others, trying to make those relationships as good as they can be, I think not only their lives, but our own lives will be better. So thank you. I'd love to answer questions, talk to you about stuff. Hello.
Thank you. Jonathan Seidel from Eugene.
Hi.
Thank you very much for coming. Can you hear me? Yep.
Now, yes.
Okay. A wonderful talk. Could you speak a little bit about empathy and sentience, consciousness? There are stories that when you cut down a tree, there's a silent scream that could be heard from one end of the world to the other.
Right.
That if you're attuned to that scream, you can hear the tree. Does that play a role in your philosophy, in your ethics? And how about compassion? If there's sentience, is there compassion? How is that related to empathy in your scheme?
So, okay, that's a really nice question. I think what I would want to say is, if we come to discover that there is something it's like to be a tree, then I think we can imagine that there might be some empathy that we can engage in. Importantly, my view is that I want to understand your perspective. If you don't have a perspective, I don't know what I'm doing. Now, I might be interested in important things about you otherwise, so I'm not saying that entangled empathy is the only way to understand the relationship I have with you. I am deeply moved both in the wetlands around where I am, but I'm horrified when there's any sort of digging happening. It's not that I'm empathizing with the wetland. There's other considerations that are going on. So that's what I would say about the tree. I don't think trees are conscious. I don't think trees are sentient. If we discover that trees are sentient, then I'd be open to that, but I don't think we've come to that yet. Now, compassion in the Buddhist sense of compassion and entangled empathy are almost identical, actually. And so there's a wonderful scholar, Dean Curtin, who's done a lovely sort of analysis of the Buddhist conception of compassion in comparison to my view of entangled empathy. So in that sense, those are very closely related. Yeah, thank you. Hello.
Hi, Lori.
Hi.
Nice to meet you. My name's Dana Villone. Nice to meet you in person. My question is about how to convert the empathetic response to action. So I use media to tell stories about conservation. I've worked with chimpanzees, and they're very compelling, a very compelling subject, and it's pretty easy to evoke the empathetic response, especially about chimpanzees. But when you're trying to get people to respond with action, whether it's direct support or changing their practices, what does your work, how does it inform how to take the next step so empathy converts to action?
Yeah, thank you. So part of what I think is important is that entangled empathy locates us within these relationships and gets us to be moved to be thinking about how to make those relationships better. So part of what's going on is that if I think to myself, there are 675 chimpanzees that are in laboratories. Okay, that's too abstract. Let's empathize with those chimpanzees. So these are chimpanzees that are, as you well know, they like to be outside. They like to have space. They're kind of rowdy, usually. They like to move around. They need social interactions. They like to have choices. They want to exhibit certain kinds of behaviors. All of that is, to a large extent, not exclusively, but it's curtailed in many laboratories. So their well-being, their flourishing, is being limited in my society, my world, my space. My relationship to them is one in which I know now that these chimpanzees are being denied the ability to flourish for no reason, actually, at this point. No reason at all other than political apathy. So if I want to be in a good relationship with them and not a bad relationship with them, I'm going to be moved to do something about that. If I recognize that my neighbor is suffering, and there's something I can do to help that neighbor not suffer, I would think of myself as a pretty bad neighbor. Would you? A pretty bad neighbor if you did nothing. And so that's partly what I'm wrestling. The action is built into a conception of oneself as being in a good relationship. Now, if you say, I don't care if I'm in bad relationships, then I don't know what to tell you. I'm hoping that many, many people want their relationships to be as good as they can be, and also that their agency isn't going... That if I'm somebody who's like, I don't care if people are suffering, I don't really care if humans are suffering, I don't really care if animals are suffering, I'm not really talking to those people. I can't get people from a point of apathy to a point of empathy. But if people are interested in how their relationships go, what their actions might do in the world, and how they might feel better, actually, this is one way to do it.
Great, thank you.
My question is about the line you've drawn between the animal and the plant kingdom, that kind of feelings. And even before Jonathan asked his question, you seem to be pretty dismissive of the idea, or, if are trees sentient? And my question is, why don't research it? Why don't you say, if we find out? Now, I'm speaking as a perspective. Some years ago, having lived in a big old tree for a while, it was a protest. And so you probably wouldn't deny my perception of feelings or the living energy, to the point where you could kind of maybe tell the difference between one species or another. But you're saying they have no perspective. Well, my experience would be that you definitely get some sort of consciousness transmission. There seems to be personalities there. Maybe the tree, though, is just sort of an antenna for something out in the cosmos, spiritual entities channeling through you. So that you'd say, well, the tree itself doesn't have a perspective. But if you looked at that, what's the difference between human people? A lot of us, we look at people and say, that's odd, you said the same thing as you. We're like all connected, in some spiritual, conscious medium. And so I still can't see why absolutely a tree and animals, and even less obviously alive things, couldn't fundamentally have the same consciousness and a feeling of individual perspective to the extent that any individual perspective exists.
Yeah, so some of you may have heard that last year, scientists declared that other animals were conscious. Last year, they just discovered that. I don't know which animals they hadn't paid attention to before that. So there's an important sense in which what I'm trying to do, as I say, I'm going to hold it open, whether or not we can understand what it is like to be a tree. I want to say that there are many, many, many kinds of experiences that one has with beings that don't have a perspective that are valuable and important. connected, loving, energetic, spiritual. All of those things are absolutely happening. So this isn't, again, to go back to one of the very first things I said, this isn't really a zero-sum idea. The idea is very much that empathy can be one way of understanding our relationships, but it's not the only way of understanding our relationships. There might be others as well.
I say, as much as it's a good idea to experience the empathy with animals, leave ourselves open to a similar relationship with plants and see what you can find.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Stephen. In your talk, you were talking about relationships with animals, and if I heard you correctly, you said something about relationships with animals we eat. I think you said that. Another professor of philosophy, he's also professor of linguistics and of cognitive science, namely Noam Chomsky, said a few years ago on the ZNet website, he said he was not himself a vegetarian, but he thought that, well, here I'm paraphrasing, he thought that that could very well be the next sort of moral advance of humanity, namely becoming a vegetarian. And I'd like to know what you think about that.
I think vegans, yeah. I think being vegan, yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that, I think there's all sorts of reasons for thinking that that's a very good way to change our relationships with other animals. Part of the reason that I say vegan is because even though we don't kill animals that produce
Milk
and
yeah.
eggs is because they're still used and they're female animals that are used in an instrumentalized way for purposes that aren't necessary. I think it's important to think about it in terms of necessity, but currently the billions of animals that are used every year globally, it's not necessary. So I think that that's really important. We were just talking earlier today about an impact of that kind of intensive production on climate change and the ways in which workers are exploited. There's just a variety of reasons for thinking very, very critically, both on the basis of justice and on the basis of empathy about the current way that animals are produced. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my question relates to the other gentleman's question. I've noticed in my life that there's a great deal of empathy and compassion to animals that are people's pets. Mm-hmm. But that compassion does not extend to animals that we eat. And in particular, most of the animals that we eat are raised in concentration camp kind of settings. And people don't seem to want to look at that. Why is that the case, and how can we increase the degree of empathy towards the animals we eat?
I think that happily, people, more and more people are aware of the conditions that are being used in industrial agriculture. In fact, one of the things that I think is actually a little bit more of a concern, I think people are increasingly aware, and I think it gets to an earlier question about what do you do when people just don't care? I think that's an important question. What do you do when people don't care about their relationships with others? So there's that issue. I think people know, but I don't know if there's enough concern. So there's more apathy. The other thing that I think is worrying in this regard is that there's this remember I said earlier that there's ways that empathy needs to be corrected. And I think one of the ways that it operates in this situation is that people, either rightly or wrongly, think of themselves as not making a difference or making too much of a difference. So there's a disproportionate understanding of what their concern, if they have the concern, might amount to. And I think that's a really interesting question. So I think that we need larger groups, social groups. There's a system in place that one individual can't really change. And so that raises, I think, deep and important questions about what does one do if one is empathizing. One could maybe go ahead and not consume animal products, which is Great, but is that really going to impact the system? So I think there's systemic. It's not epistemic. What you're asking is about epistemic. I don't think it's an epistemic problem.
What does epistemic mean?
Knowing. Do people know this? I think people know this. I think there's a problem of motivation or concern on the one hand, and then there's just a problem of sort of what does one person do, or how do we change the system? I think that's a real problem. And I didn't answer that.
You don't have the
I didn't
answer.
answer that question.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Hi there. I'm interested in what you have to say, or what entangled empathy has to say about the welfare of an individual versus a group. And then I would like to hear your thoughts about the idea of a hierarchy of consciousness and how empathy plays into that, or how that plays into empathy.
Okay, so hierarchy of consciousness, I don't know what that means. I don't think there's some more...
It's the idea that there are organisms like humans who may be able to experience a wider range or a more rich consciousness, whereas you have an individual, possibly like an ant, who does not have that wide of a spectrum or that deep of an understanding. And so there is a thought out there that the welfare of the ant can be considered as less worth protecting compared to a human or a chimpanzee based on their level of consciousness.
Right. Okay, so that's one of the things that would come out of a justice approach as opposed to an empathy approach. Potentially, not exclusively, but it could come out. With an empathy approach, you're not going to get that. The welfare of this ant, if you're taking the perspective of this, let's do something like a fish. If you're taking the perspective of a fish, that's your perspective. The experience then becomes that limited experience. It's not about bigger or smaller. You're not making that comparison. You're trying to take that perspective and do a certain kind of back and forth reflection to understand that perspective, but it's still going to be that perspective. So you're not going to do a comparison. You're not going to say, oh, well, this fish had this experience and this elephant had this experience, and therefore I'm going to say the elephant's sense of flourishing is more important than the fish's experience of flourishing, because the fish's experience of flourishing to the fish is as important as the elephant's experience of flourishing is to that elephant. So they don't, you see how you don't get bigger brains, give you more weight. So that's how I would answer that question. There was the first question.
Yeah, and then it ties in. So does entangled empathy have anything to say about welfare of one individual versus another? So for instance, when humans managing the earth have to weigh actions that will benefit one organism, species, whatever, versus possibly hurt or damage another,
right.
When using entangled empathy, because we're so particular about looking at the individual, right. Is it useful in that, or is there some other way we should be looking at it?
Right. So, okay, so I'm going to philosophically, I don't know if you're a philosopher or not, but philosophically, what I'm trying to suggest is that there is the sort of value theoretic part of the picture. And it does provide motivation for action, but it's not giving you any sort of principled guidance for action in conflict. I think it can help in getting that way, and you can adopt a whole number of different kinds of deliberative sort of processes to figure out what's overall how to resolve this conflict. What entangled empathy can do is help you get a much richer sense of what this conflict looks like, but it's not necessarily going to help you, if that's what you were asking.
That's exactly what I wanted. Thank you.
How can you be fully and genuinely empathetic for both animals and humans alike and not feel the pain and intense suffering and just depression of what they're feeling?
Right. I think that's such a hard and important question. And I think that part of what it takes, part of why I think this notion of entangled empathy is important in thinking about our relationships beyond the human, is that if we're just feeling it, so remember, entangled empathy isn't just feeling, it's also reflection and imagination and modulation. And we're going to do correctives. So if you're too empathetic, like I am, like you are, we're going to have to take care. We're going to have to be careful, because otherwise we're not going to be able to be engaged in the world if we just let all of this flood over us. This is what I was saying, too, about these mass suffering. How do you actually empathize? If you imagine, 75,000 hens in a barn, and their inability to stretch their wings, and you just can't really put yourself in that position. So what you use entangled empathy for is to understand the perspective of a couple, but then depending, you need to worry about overloading yourself. And I think there's really tremendous, psychologists, another way of thinking about this, and I talk about it in the book, if you're a doctor in a war zone and you're really empathetic, you're not going to be able to do your job, right? So what you need to do in that context is modulate or contain some of your empathetic engagement, because your job's an important job. And ultimately, if you're concerned about flourishing, you're going to want to do your job as well as you can do your job to help as many flourish as you can help. And so psychologists, too, clinical psychologists who are working with trauma victims, for example, people who kind of come in with PTSD regularly, how do they, I mean, it's always really important as a psychologist to empathize with the person, your client, or your patient. But if you're empathizing with every patient that comes through your door every day of the week, you're going to not be able to do your job. So what psychologists have developed are all sorts of skills for how do you reimagine, how do you take yourself out of that. You have to then bring your cognition and your reflection to bear. So what you would do is you think, okay, I helped somebody yesterday, or I loved my dog, or I did these things, and you reframe, you distract yourself. There's all sorts of skills that you can develop to help you not become overwhelmed. And if you are personally overwhelmed by this, Patrice Jones's book, Aftershock, is a very important book to read.
Thank you very much.
I have not read your book, so I don't know if you delineate this problem, but it has to do with what I see as a systematic bias that would be introduced by the empathy approach as far as compared to a broader justice when thinking about animals in the natural environment. If we take seriously that all animals deserve justice, it really takes you at the species level and not your ability to individually empathize with individuals, which creates a systematic bias towards large, charismatic mammals. So, for example, I worked in an animal lab as an undergraduate. We were studying brown tree snakes. They did not have their natural environment in the lab. We were studying them because they're invasive species in Guam and they have systematically exterminated almost all of the wildlife of Guam. Now, trying to individually empathize with a brown tree snake or with an individual bird, which may be one of the last of its species, seems totally irrelevant to tackling the problem of an invasive species driving other animals to extinction.
Okay, so I guess I agree and disagree with that. And let me say why I agree and why I disagree. So one of the things that conservation biologists have done for a long time is just not pay attention to the individual needs and interests and behaviors of the animals that they're trying to conserve. And as a result, many, many conservation efforts have failed. And that's why there's a new sort of set of principles that are being adopted, compassionate conservation, which is actually concerned with the particular well-being of individuals. So when you recognize, for example, the social relationships that are in play, and snakes are going to be harder, so that's where I'm going to agree with you, but here's where I'm disagreeing. If you have a group of individuals that you're trying to move, let's say, from one area where they're not going to survive to another as a conservation practice, the success of the movement is going to largely depend on how you move the individuals and who is moved, right? And you're not going to be able to know which individuals are going to be important, centrally important, in reorganizing the social nature of the group in a new environment unless you spend a lot of time what I'm calling empathizing, understanding, taking the perspective of the individuals in the group. So there's a back and forth here that's not just about individuals outside of their context. It's always about contextual observation as well. So I think that conservation efforts are going to be greatly enhanced by developing a kind of entangled empathy. And the compassionate conservationists are very, very interested in this, precisely this idea. So you're going to need to figure out who's who in a social network, not just see these individuals as a mass part of one species whole. So in that sense, I'm disagreeing. When it comes to certain kinds of others, it's going to be a lot harder to empathize. And I think that's...
I still don't see how this applies to brown tree snakes that are wiping out the native flora and fauna. The reason we're studying the lab is to understand them and understand their behavior, but that's not about empathizing with them. It's understanding the brown tree snake's behaviors and how they've sort of gone awry when they're out of their natural environment.
And you don't think they took any empathy to understand the behavior?
No. Well, I'm not trying to be a brown tree snake. I'm studying it as a creature with its own characteristics. I don't pretend, or nor do I think it's possible or appropriate beyond some sort of sentimental imagining that I would know what a brown tree snake feels, and it's not relevant to the project, to me.
I think if you don't think it's relevant to the project, you don't think it's relevant to the project. I mean, one of the things that people told Jane Goodall repeatedly was that she was overly sentimental in her understanding of the chimpanzees. In fact, she's, I think, one of the really important scientists to understanding chimpanzees and to understanding the way that they engage in the world. I know that many people thought and continue to think that her understanding them as individuals, naming them, thinking about them, and their characteristics and their personalities was not important, but I think, I think it was, and I think we have established that it was. I think the same is true for the preservation of various populations of wolves, various populations of, elephants, rhinoceros, I could just list a number, kangaroos, various birds. I think that it's really a matter of part of the understanding of those. So it's not sentimentalism, only sentimentalism, right? It's not just feelings. It's understanding the perspective of the other. And I think part of what it takes to understand the behavior of something so different as a brown tree snake is to really try to get at what they're doing. What are they like? What are they trying? What is their perspective? That's how you're going to understand their behavior. Otherwise, you could just be a behaviorist. Oh, well, when this stimuli happens, this response happens. But I think that there's lots of things we miss when we have that view. Now, in terms of the conflict, that's what I said.
So in this sense, by empathy, you mean basically just studying the animal in its context?
It definitely, studying animals in the context is part of empathy, and understanding the behaviors of animals is largely going to depend on how we empathize with them, right? It's not just this feeling. That's partly what I was suggesting. It's not just a feeling. It's a process. It's a process whereby you have emotional or feeling states, affective states, cognitive states, imaginary states, a bunch of knowledge about context, behavior. You learn from experts who've spent time with brown snakes, lots of time with brown tree snakes. So it's a process. So the empathy I'm arguing for is not just like, I like this, or I feel good about this, or I want to be nice to it. That's not the view.
Hi, so my question is about basically what you were talking about at the end of your presentation with chimpanzees and how they're relocating them to sanctuaries. I'm curious what you think about kind of your vision for endangered species and animals that we're attempting to be empathetic with. So a lot of studies have shown that quality of life is a purpose, having a meaning is important to enhance people's quality of life, animals' quality of life. Do you think that the movement towards sanctuaries or the wild, what is like your vision for chimpanzees and other animals, and what we can do to collaboratively empathize with them? And you were saying the focus of like flourishing. So what would be flourishing? when maybe putting them back in the wild would be displacing other animals or displacing those animals themselves due to climate change issues and deforestation. So what's the vision in your eyes of what we should do? Is it sanctuaries? Is it putting animals back into the wild, or what do you see?
So it's going to largely depend, again, on the specifics, right? So it's going to depend a lot on the individual animals, and it's also going to depend on sort of the conditions for the larger groups. So for example, chimpanzees have been in captivity in this country since the 1920s. Some chimpanzees that are alive today in captivity are 6th or 7th generation captives. It doesn't even matter if they're 6th or 7th generation captives. Many of them don't know the natural kinds of behaviors that they would have learned if they were wild. Some of them have learned from wild-born or wild-caught chimpanzees, but that number is diminishing because we haven't brought in chimpanzees from the wild for quite a long time. So there are some chimpanzees that were wild-caught that have taught captive-born chimpanzees what you might call survival skills, but that in itself doesn't matter because the habitat's being destroyed. The rate of captivity of chimpanzees is highest in range countries in equatorial Africa because their habitat's being destroyed. So to take chimpanzees out of the laboratories, as we were talking about, and put them in the wild is not a recipe for flourishing, as we could say. And so sanctuary is the option. And so then the question becomes, how do we understand what is in their best interests? And part of what it's going to take in order to help them to flourish in captivity, in sanctuary, is knowledge about so chimpanzees, and I won't go too far into chimpanzees because I can go into my chimpanzee hole. But I won't go into my chimpanzee hole. But chimpanzees are hierarchical, and they are male-dominated in their groups. Somebody's always at the low end of the hierarchy. So that means that and they're aggressive. So somebody is always going to be injured. It's the nature of chimpanzee life. If you're interacting with these chimpanzees, it's really hard, especially if you're being empathetic, to see this individual who's at the bottom of the hierarchy getting whomped all the time. But to really be engaged and have entangled empathy is to recognize that this is what chimpanzees do. And this is how chimpanzees are. And sometimes the chimpanzee on the bottom may not be on the bottom. Someone else will be on the bottom. Somebody's always on the bottom of the hierarchy, but that can shift. Okay, so what I'm getting at is that in order to help chimpanzees flourish in captivity requires understanding the individuals that are in the group, understanding what chimpanzee behavior looks like, understanding whether and how you might need to intervene, whether to leave things alone, even if it looks to you initially like that's not very good. So those are the kinds of things that one would have to do. Now it depends too on the other species. So I know chimpanzees pretty well, so this is what I can tell you about chimpanzees. I don't know mountain gorillas very well, so I don't know what I would say about that. But someone does, right? So this is the process where you try to find out as much as you can about the conditions that these individuals and groups are facing and work to try to promote their flourishing in whatever context we can. And for some animals, we're not going to. I mean, orangutans are going to go extinct in the next 10 years. We could do as much as we can do, but we have to accept the fact that we are living in a time in which our relationships to orangutans are coming to an end, and there's very little we're going to be able to do to stop that.
So just a quick follow-up. For environmentalists making decisions based on wild animals, how are we supposed to, what would be the method if it takes understanding the relationships, the circles, the groups, the individuals? What do we do when we're trying to understand and make the right decisions for animals that we are so distanced from, that we don't know, such as mountain lions? What are we supposed to do to know what the right decision should be for that?
Well, I think that's why we need people. There's lots of people who know lots. So that's why I was suggesting that we look to experts to help. And hopefully there are experts that are going to be doing work based on an empathetic engagement with the other animals.
Thank you.
I have a question about native cultures more. It's more of a cultural thing and how they engage with animals as opposed to our approach.
Right.
Their relationships with the animals, not to be naive about it, I mean, just it seems that they've always been able to maintain a balance with their other life forms besides their own. Seemingly, not always, but an easier time than we have. In other words, the religious, to say the one God religions that we live in, that culture, as opposed to the native cultures, which see life in, they see the energy in all kinds of forms. So that, I'm trying to articulate this, but
Right.
do you have a sense of what I'm saying?
Yes.
How about their relationship with the animals specifically?
Right.
How do they,
So-
how do you see it?
So I think that's too general. It's too so lots of different cultures have different ways of
Right.
engaging with animals and different relationships with animals, and I don't know sort of how to think about it in the abstract or the general, right? So there are remarkably interesting. So for example, I have a student I'm working with right now who is working with the Karen people in northern Thailand who have relationships with elephants, and it's a very complicated and long-standing set of relationships with elephants that involves a partnership with the elephants. It involves using elephants, so it's not that they're working with elephants. The mahouts work with the elephants, but they have a very spiritual side to the relationship with the elephants. And in the context of Thailand, where there is this sort of, if you know anything about the elephant quote-unquote problem in Thailand, what's happened is that there's a number of elephants that are kept in captivity as an improvement over the street-begging elephants, but now they're in these camps, so they're not in good conditions at all. And the Karen people, who are this mountain hill tribe, are trying to get their elephants back into the forests, but they're not going to be completely free in the forests. They're going to try to alter. See, so I guess that's a specific case,
Yeah,
right?
well,
And that's just one case of
Yeah.
who knows how many cases.
Well, I mean, the only thing I could say is I have an experience in one specific area. I mean, it has to do with Native people, which is the indigenous people on this ground, this country that we live in. And when I first was involved with them, I just noticed a completely different cultural thing. They had a relationship based in their culture with animals, wild animals, the animals that they ate, the animals that they existed with, as well as plants and everything else. And it was very different than what I was raised with. We didn't. It was just. We had an arrogance with everything else, besides us.
Right.
That's the way we are.
Yeah. So what I'm just talking,
They didn't have that, so I was shocked. But then they seem to have an easier time, and of course, we have extinction problems globally.
Right.
So for me, it's funny. I have an easier time being empathic with animals and other life forms than I do with humans in a lot of ways. They just are. They are their natural self, and humans are much more complicated, obviously. But I'm saying is that this one thing struck me as in regards to animals, and ever since then it woke up my animal thing, in a way. Other than pets, as a kid.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of different ways of being engaged, and we can learn from. We can learn more about how different people empathetically engage with other animals. I mean, I'm mostly thinking about how, at the moment, what we face, is a system in which the animals that that we're in relationship with, meaning sort of most of us in this room, is a relationship with disposability and killability. And I think it's really important to shift that. And the question then is justice the way to do that, or is empathy the way to do that? And I think empathy has a very large role to play, and I think that justice can fall under empathy. And I think that might be the more useful way. And I don't know enough about all of these various different cultures and the way of interacting with animals, but I'm much more concerned about sort of the disposability question and the way the disposability question of our relationship with other animals impacts our relationship with other humans as well. Right?
All right, thank you.
You seem
Hello.
to have is this on?
Well, we seem to have an orphan microphone here, and I'd just like to make a comment. This is not really a question. Beyond questions of justice and empathy, I think we need to insert the idea of respect for the biosphere, which we do not completely understand. I spend many mornings between October and April planting trees, and of course, I saw the tree that was 3,500 years and was burnt down. Well, I happen to know that there are many trees which do not have 3,500-year life cycles. But we plant trees not because we have sentient feelings about the trees. We plant them for self-preservation, because the trees do the opposite of what we do when we breathe. And I don't know about many people in this room, but I'm rather fond of breathing. So, and as far as that goes, I mean, respect for the biosphere, we've discussed animals, people, plants. I would like to insert rocks into the conversation, and specifically the Black Hills of South Dakota. Okay. Because beyond the questions of justice, it speaks to the idea of respect for the biosphere. And when we create great monuments, Mount Rushmore, to, I guess, people who were slave owners, then we have to at least think about what we are doing to the environment when we undertake projects such as this.
Yes, thank you. I do think there are other ways of thinking about the biosphere, and I think that's consistent.
Just one last quick question. I'm curious about your opinion of zoos.
Okay.
Zoos?
Yes,
I just have a very vivid memory of being a child looking at a single, isolated cage with a gorilla in it, and it probably wasn't much larger than the gorilla. And so I'm curious what you have to say about zoos.
Well, I have a whole bunch of things to say about zoos, but I have a book called The Ethics of Captivity, and it discusses a lot of the topics that are related to zoos, and I have my own little piece in that volume in which I sort of think about questions of dignity in the context of captivity, and particularly in zoos. Zoos are complicated places. I think that for the most part, it's very difficult to keep animals in captivity well, and I think most zoos fail to keep animals in captivity well in zoos. But having said that, there's a couple of interesting and important practical considerations to raise about zoos. So for example, the person, again, sorry to focus on my chimpanzee knowledge, but there are a number of chimpanzees that are living in conditions that are pretty bad. So people's homes, or mostly their garages, or cages or enclosures in the back of their homes. And those chimpanzees need to be with other chimpanzees, and one place where chimpanzees can be with other chimpanzees is in zoos. There's a few zoos that have chimpanzee troops that are fairly well cared for. Gorillas too. Most great apes now are not housed in the way that you're remembering. But even then, we have old-fashioned ideas about what constitutes their well-being and what they need. And so I think that there's just a lot of variety. You know, at the Detroit Zoo, we talked about this earlier, Ron Kagan was one of the first to realize that elephants shouldn't be in zoos, that there's no way that you can have an elephant who actually likes to move large distances in a small zoo. The zoo can't provide enough space for elephants. But, you know, there's 18 elephants being imported from Swaziland for zoos, even though we know elephants don't do well in zoos. So it's a complicated question. Zoos could potentially be places where real significant conservation work was done, but they're not that right now. And so, but then that also raises this problem of what to do with animals that are in captivity. Go ahead.
I'm hearing the argument that, well, if we didn't have zoos, then we wouldn't be able to understand or be exposed to these animals and thus want to save them.
Yeah, that's a PR rhetoric that's been used. There's been studies actually that have been done that show that people who go to zoos and leave zoos, that there's no change in attitude about animals, about conservation, about any of those things that have. I mean, many studies that have been done about this. So that I don't think is actually the issue. Ron Kagan, again, at the Detroit Zoo, has made the argument, and I think this is a really important one to consider, that the role of zoos should be more like sanctuaries. So we should turn zoos into sanctuaries. Then how that works in terms of visits, how that works in terms of funding, those are really kind of important practical questions, and I don't mean to dismiss them. It's just not my area of expertise. I don't think we're going to be getting rid of zoos. I think and hope that thinking about bringing more animals into captivity is something that will increasingly cause zoo managers pause, but that hasn't happened yet. And in the context of, say, we were talking about frogs and toads, it actually is a great place, given that frogs and toads are threatened all over the world. And the Detroit Zoo is doing a marvelous job of actually promoting and conserving frogs and toads. So it's really also, again, very context specific.
I was just going to tag on to that. I was surprised to learn in graduate school that zoos bring in more money than professional sports. So there's a lot of potential for a revenue stream to be funneled towards conservation efforts. But it is complicated, and I think that different species require a different discussion. Every species has to be looked at specifically, whether they're appropriate in captivity or blanket, no, they're not. But there is a lot, and some zoos are doing incredible conservation work in country. So, you know, having a black and white view of zoos is easy. I feel very strongly about when I go to zoos, it's so depressing. But I've had to open up to the possibility they play an